Hospital Sketches by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 4, A Night. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 4, A Night. Being fond of the night side of nature, I was soon promoted to the post of night nurse, with every facility for indulging in my favorite pastime of owling. My colleague, a black-eyed widow, relieved me at dawn, we two taking care of the ward between us, like the immortal Sary and Betsy, turn and turn about. I usually found my boys in the jolliest state of mind their condition allowed, for it was a known fact that Nurse Periwinkle objected to blue devils, and entertained a belief that he who laughed most was surest of recovery. At the beginning of my reign, dumps and dismals prevailed, the nurses looked anxious and tired, the men gloomy or sad, and a general "hark from the tombs a doleful sound" style of conversation seemed to be the fashion, a state of things which caused one coming from a merry social New England town to feel as if she had got into an exhausted receiver, and the instinct of self-preservation, to say nothing of a philanthropic desire to serve the race, caused a speedy change in Ward Number 1. More flattering than the most gracefully turned compliment, more grateful than the most admiring glance, was the sight of those rows of faces, all strange to me a little while ago, now lighting up with smiles of welcome as I came among them, enjoying that moment heartily, with a womanly pride in their regard, a motherly affection for them all. The evenings were spent in reading aloud, writing letters, waiting on and amusing the men, going the rounds with Dr. P. as he made his second daily survey, dressing my dozen wounds afresh, giving last doses, and making them cozy for the long hours to come, till the 9 o'clock bell rang, the gas was turned down, the day nurses went off duty, the night watch came on, and my nocturnal adventure began. My ward was now divided into 3 rooms, and, under favor of the matron, I had managed to sort out the patients in such a way that I had what I called my duty room, my pleasure room, and my pathetic room, and worked for each in a different way. One I visited armed with a dressing tray full of rollers, plasters, and pins, another with books, flowers, games, and gossip, a third with teapots, lullabies, consolation, and sometimes a shroud. Wherever the sickest or most helpless man chanced to be, there I held my watch, often visiting the other rooms to see that the general watchman of the ward did his duty by the fires, and the wounds, the latter needing constant wetting. Not only on this account did I meander, but also to get fresher air than the close rooms afforded, for, owing to the stupidity of that mysterious somebody who does all the damage in the world, the windows had been carefully nailed down above, and the lower sashes could only be raised in the mildest weather, for the men lay just below. I had suggested a summary smashing of a few panes here and there, when frequent appeals to headquarters had proved unavailing, and daily orders to lazy attendants had come to nothing. No one seconded the motion, however, and the nails were far beyond my reach, for, though belonging to the sisterhood of ministering angels, I had no wings, and might as well have asked for Jacob's ladder as a pair of steps in that charitable chaos. One of the harmless ghosts who bore me company during the haunted hours was Dan, the watchman, whom I regarded with a certain awe, for, though so much together, I never fairly saw his face, and, but for his legs, should never have recognized him, as we seldom met by day. These legs were remarkable, as was his whole figure, for his body was short, rotund, and done up in a big jacket and muffler, his beard hid the lower part of his face, his hat brimmed the upper, and all I ever discovered was a pair of sleepy eyes and a very mild voice. But the legs, very long, very thin, very crooked and feeble, looking like gray sausages in their tight coverings, without a ray of peg-topishness about them, and finished off with a pair of expansive green cloth shoes, very like Chinese junks, with the sails down. This figure, gliding noiselessly about the dimly lighted rooms, was strongly suggestive of the spirit of a beer barrel mounted on corkscrews, haunting the old hotel in search of its lost mates, emptied and staved in long ago. Another goblin who frequently appeared to me was the attendant of the pathetic room, who, being a faithful soul, was often up to tend 2 or 3 men, weak and wandering as babies after the fever had gone. The amiable creature beguiled the watches of the night by brewing jorgums of a fearful beverage which he called coffee, and insisted on sharing with me, coming in with a great bowl of something like mud soup, scalding hot, guiltless of cream, rich in all-pervading flavor of molasses, scorch, and tin pot. Such an amount of goodwill and neighborly kindness also went into the mess, that I never could find the heart to refuse, but always received it with thanks, sipped it with hypocritical relish, while he remained, and whipped it into the slop jar the instant he departed, thereby gratifying him, securing one rousing laugh in the doziest hour of the night, and no one was the worse for the transaction but the pigs. Whether they were cut off untimely in their sins or not, I carefully abstained from inquiring. It was a strange life, asleep half the day, exploring Washington the other half, and all night hovering like a massive cherubim in a red rigolette over the slumbering sons of man. I liked it, and found many things to amuse, instruct, and interest me. The snores alone were quite a study, varying from the mild sniff to the stentorian snort, which startled the echoes and hoisted the performer erect, to accuse his neighbor of the deed, magnanimously forgive him, and wrapping the drapery of his couch about him, lie down to vocal slumber. After listening for a week to this band of wind instruments, I indulged in the belief that I could recognize each by the snore alone, and was tempted to join the chorus by breaking out with John Brown's favorite hymn, "Blow ye the trumpet, blow." I would have given much to have possessed the art of sketching, for many of the faces became wonderfully interesting when unconscious. Some grew stern and grim. The men, evidently dreaming of war, as they gave orders, groaned over their wounds, or damned the rebels vigorously. Some grew sad and infinitely pathetic, as if the pain, borne silently all day, revenged itself by now betraying what the man's pride had concealed so well. Often the roughest grew young and pleasant when sleep smoothed the hard lines away, letting the real nature assert itself. Many almost seemed to speak, and I learned to know these men better by night than through any intercourse by day. Sometimes they disappointed me, for faces that looked merry and good in the light grew bad and sly when the shadows came, and though they made no confidences in words, I read their lives, leaving them to wonder at the change of manner this midnight magic wrought in their nurse. A few talked busily, one drummer boy sang sweetly, though no persuasions could win a note from him by day, and several depended on being told what they had talked of in the morning. Even my constitutionals in the chilly halls possessed a certain charm, for the house was never still. Sentinels tramped round it all night long, their muskets glittering in the wintry moonlight as they walked, or stood before the doors, straight and silent as figures of stone, causing one to conjure up romantic visions of guarded forts, sudden surprises, and daring deeds, for in these war times the humdrum life of Yankeedom had vanished, and the most prosaic feel some thrill of that excitement which stirs the nation's heart and makes its capital a camp of hospitals. Wandering up and down these lower halls, I often heard cries from above, steps hurrying to and fro, saw surgeons passing up, or men coming down carrying a stretcher, where lay a long white figure, whose face was shrouded, and whose fight was done. Sometimes I stopped to watch the passers in the street, the moonlight shining on the spire opposite, or the gleam of some vessel floating like a white-winged seagull down the broad Potomac, whose fullest flow can never wash away the red stain of the land. The night, whose events I have a fancy to record, opened with a little comedy, and closed with a great tragedy, for a virtuous and useful life, untimely ended, is always tragic to those who see not as God sees. My headquarters were beside the bed of a New Jersey boy crazed by the horrors of that dreadful Saturday. A slight wound in the knee brought him here, but his mind had suffered more than his body. Some string of that delicate machine was overstrained, and, for days, had been reliving in imagination the scenes he could not forget, till his distress broke out in incoherent ravings, pitiful to hear. As I sat by him, endeavoring to soothe his poor distracted brain by the constant touch of wet hands over his hot forehead, he lay cheering his comrades on, hurrying them back, then counting them as they fell around him, often clutching my arm to drag me from the vicinity of a bursting shell, or covering up his head to screen himself from a shower of shot, his face brilliant with fever, his eyes restless, his head never still, every muscle strained and rigid, while an incessant stream of defiant shouts, whispered warnings, and broken laments poured from his lips with that forceful bewilderment which makes such wanderings so hard to overhear. It was past 11, and my patient was slowly wearying himself into fitful intervals of quietude, when in one of these pauses a curious sound arrested my attention. Looking over my shoulder, I saw a one-legged phantom hopping nimbly down the room, and going to meet it, recognized a certain Pennsylvania gentleman whose wound fever had taken a turn for the worse, and, depriving him of the few wits a drunken campaign had left him, set him literally tripping on the light, fantastic toe toward home, as he blandly informed me, touching the military cap, which formed a striking contrast to the severe simplicity of the rest of his decidedly undress uniform. When sane, the least movement produced a roar of pain or a volley of oaths, but the departure of reason seemed to have wrought an agreeable change both in the man and his manners, for, balancing himself on one leg, like a meditative stork, he plunged into an animated discussion of the war, the President, lager beer, and Enfield rifles, regardless of any suggestions of mine as to the propriety of returning to bed, lest he be court-martialed for desertion. Anything more supremely ridiculous can hardly be imagined than this figure, scantily draped in white, its one foot covered with a big blue sock, a dingy cap set rakingly askew on its shaven head, and placid satisfaction beaming in its broad red face as it flourished a mug in one hand, an old boot in the other, calling them canteen and knapsack, while it skipped and fluttered in the most unearthly fashion. What to do with the creature I didn't know. Dan was absent, and if I went to find him, the perambulator might festoon himself out of the window, set his toga on fire, or do some of his neighbors a mischief. The attendant of the room was sleeping like a near relative of the celebrated Seven, and nothing short of pins would rouse him, for he had been out that day, and whiskey asserted its supremacy in balmy whiffs. Still declaiming in a fine blow of eloquence, the demented gentleman hopped on, blind and deaf to my graspings and entreaties, and I was about to slam the door in his face and run for help, when a second and saner phantom, all in white, came to the rescue in the likeness of a big Prussian who spoke no English, but divined the crisis and put an end to it by bundling the lively monoped into his bed like a baby, with an authoritative command to stay put, which received added weight from being delivered in an odd conglomeration of French and German, accompanied by warning wags of a head decorated with a yellow cotton nightcap, rendered most imposing by a tassel-like bell-pull. Rather exhausted by his excursion, the member from Pennsylvania subsided, and, after an irrepressible laugh together, my Prussian ally and myself were returning to our places, when the echo of a sob caused us to glance along the beds. It came from one in the corner, such a small bed, and such a tearful little face looked up at us as we stopped beside it. The 12-years-old drummer boy was not singing now, but sobbing with a manly effort all the while to stifle the distressful sounds that would break out. "What is it, Teddy?" I asked as he rubbed the tears away, and checked himself in the middle of a great sob to answer plaintively. "I've got a chill, ma'am, but I ain't crying for that, 'cause I'm used to it. I dreamed Kit was here, and when I waked up he wasn't, and I couldn't help it then." The boy came in with the rest, and the man who was taken dead from the ambulance was the Kit he mourned. Well he might, for, when the wounded were brought from Fredericksburg, the child lay in one of the camps thereabout, and his good friend, though sorely hurt himself, would not leave him to the exposure and neglect of such a time and place, but wrapping him in his own blanket, carried him in his arms to the transport, tended him during the passage, and only yielded up his charge when death met him at the door of the hospital, which promised care and comfort for the boy. For 10 days Teddy had shivered or burned with fever and ague, pining the while for Kit, and refusing to be comforted because he had not been able to thank him for the generous protection which, perhaps, had cost the giver's life. The vivid dream that wrung the childish heart with a fresh pang, and when I tried the solace fitted for his years, the remorseful fear that haunted him found vent in a fresh burst of tears as he looked at the wasted hands I was endeavoring to warm. "Oh, if I'd only been as thin when Kit carried me as I am now, maybe he wouldn't have died, but I was heavy. He was hurt worser than we knew, and so it killed him, and I didn't see him to say good-bye." This thought had troubled him in secret, and my assurances that his friend would probably have died at all events hardly assuaged the bitterness of his regretful grief. At this juncture the delirious man began to shout, the one-legged rose up in his bed as if preparing for another dart, Teddy bewailed himself more piteously than before, and if ever a woman was at her wits' end, that distracted female was Nurse Periwinkle, during the space of 2 or 3 minutes, as she vibrated between the 3 beds like an agitated pendulum. Like a most opportune reinforcement, Dan the Bandy appeared, and devoted himself to the lively party, leaving me free to return to my post, for the Prussian, with a nod and a smile, took the lad away to his own bed, and lulled him to sleep with a soothing murmur, like a mammoth, humble bee. I liked that in Fritz, and if he ever wondered afterward at the dainties which sometimes found their way into his rations, or the extra comforts of his bed, he might have found a solution of the mystery in sundry persons' knowledge of that fatherly action of that night. Hardly was I settled again when the inevitable bull appeared, and its bearer delivered a message I had expected, yet dreaded to receive. "John is going, ma'am, and wants to see you if you can come." "The moment this boy is asleep, tell him so, and let me know if I'm in danger of being too late." My Ganymede departed, and while I quieted poor Shaw, I thought of John. He came in a day or 2 after the others, and one evening, when I entered my pathetic room, I found a lately emptied bed occupied by a large, fair man, with a fine face, and the serenest eyes I ever met. One of the earlier comers had often spoken of a friend who had remained behind, and those apparently worse wounded than himself might reach a shelter first. It seemed a David and Jonathan sort of friendship. The man fretted for his mate, and was never tired of praising John, his courage, sobriety, self-denial, and unfailing kindness of heart, always winding up with, "He's an out-and-out fine feller, ma'am. You see if he ain't." I had some curiosity to behold this piece of excellence, and when he came, watched him for a night or two, before I made friends with him, for, to tell the truth, I was a little afraid of the stately-looking man, whose bed had to be lengthened to accommodate his commanding stature, who seldom spoke, uttered no complaint, asked no sympathy, but tranquilly observed what went on about him, and, as he lay high upon his pillows, no picture of dying statesman or warrior was ever fuller of real dignity than this Virginia blacksmith. A most attractive face he had, framed in brown hair and beard, comely featured and full of vigor, and yet unsubdued by pain, thoughtful and often beautifully mild, while watching the afflictions of others, as if entirely forgetful of his own. His mouth was grave and firm, and plenty of will and courage in its lines, but a smile could make it as sweet as any woman's, and his eyes were child's eyes, looking one fairly in the face, with a clear, straightforward glance, which promised well for such as placed their faith in him. He seemed to cling to life as if it were rich in duties and delights, and he had learned the secret of content. The only time I saw his composure disturbed was when my surgeon brought another to examine John, who scrutinized their faces with an anxious look, asking of the elder, "Do you think I shall pull through, sir?" "I hope so, my man." And as the two passed on, John's eyes still followed them with an intentness which would have won a clearer answer from them had they seen it. A momentary shadow flitted over his face, then came the usual serenity, as if, in that brief eclipse, he had acknowledged the existence of some hard possibility, and, asking nothing yet hoping all things, left the issue in God's hands, with that submission which is true piety. The next night, as I went my rounds with Dr. P., I happened to ask which man in the room probably suffered most, and, to my great surprise, he glanced at John. "Every breath he draws is like a stab, for the ball pierced the left lung, broke a rib, and did no end of damage here and there, so the poor lad can find neither forgetfulness nor ease, because he must lie on his wounded back or suffocate. It will be a hard struggle and a long one, for he possesses great vitality, but even his tempered life can't save him. I wish it could." "You don't mean he must die, doctor?" "Bless you, there's not the slightest hope for him, and you'd better tell him so before long. Women have a way of doing such things comfortably, so I leave it to you. He won't last more than a day or two at furthest." I could have sat down on the spot and cried heartily if I had not learned the wisdom of bottling up one's tears for leisure moments. Such an end seemed very hard for such a man, when half a dozen worn-out, worthless bodies round him were gathering up the remnants of wasted lives, to linger on for years perhaps, burdens to others, daily reproaches to themselves. The army needed men like John, earnest, brave, and faithful, fighting for liberty and justice with both heart and hand, true soldiers of the Lord. I could not give him up so soon, or think with any patience of so excellent a nature robbed of its fulfillment and blundered into eternity by the rashness or stupidity of those at whose hands so many lives may be required. It was an easy thing for Dr. P. to say, "Tell him he must die," but a cruelly hard thing to do, and by no means as comfortable as he politely suggested. I had not the heart to do it then, and privately indulged the hope that some change for the better might take place, in spite of gloomy prophecies so rendering my task unnecessary. A few minutes later, as I came in again with fresh rollers, I saw John sitting erect, with no one to support him, while the surgeon dressed his back. I had never hitherto seen it done, for, having simpler wounds to attend to, and knowing the fidelity of the attendant, I had left John to him, thinking it might be more agreeable and safe, for both strength and experience were needed in his case. I had forgotten that the strong man might long for the gentle tendance of a woman's hands, the sympathetic magnetism of a woman's presence, as well as the feebler souls about him. The doctor's words caused me to reproach myself with neglect, not of any real duty perhaps, but of those little cares and kindnesses that solace homesick spirits, and make the heavy hours pass easier. John looked lonely and forsaken just then, as he sat with head bent, hands folded on his knee, and no outward sign of suffering, till, looking nearer, I saw great tears roll down and drop upon the floor. It was a new sight there, for, though I had seen many suffer, some swore, some groaned, most endured silently, but none wept. Yet it did not seem weak, only very touching, and straightway my fear vanished, my heart opened wide and took him in, as gathering the bent head in my arms, as freely as if he had been a little child, I said, "Let me help you bear it, John." Never on any human countenance have I seen so swift and beautiful a look of gratitude, surprise, and comfort, as that which answered me more eloquently than the whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, this is right good, this is what I wanted." "Then why not ask for it before?" "I didn't like to be a trouble, you seem so busy, and I could manage to get on alone." "You shall not want it any more, John." Nor did he, for now I understood the wistful look that sometimes followed me as I went out, after a brief pause beside his bed, or merely a passing nod while busied with those who seemed to need me more than he, because more urgent in their demands. Now I knew that to him, as to so many, I was the poor substitute for mother, wife, or sister, and, in his eyes, no stranger, but a friend who hitherto had seemed neglectful, for in his modesty he had never guessed the truth. This was changed now. Through the tedious operation of probing, bathing, and dressing his wounds, he leaned against me, holding my hand fast, and, if pain wrung further tears from him, no one saw them fall but me. When he was laid down again, I hovered about him in a remorseful state of mind that would not let me rest till I had bathed his face, brushed his bonny brown hair, set all things smooth about him, and laid a knot of heath and heliotrope on his clean pillow. While doing this, he watched me with the satisfied expression I so like to see, and when I offered the little nosegay, held it carefully in his great hand, smoothed a ruffled leaf or two, surveyed and smelt it with an air of genuine delight, and lay contentedly regarding the glimmer of the sunshine on the green. Although the manliest man among my 40, he said, "Yes, ma'am," like a little boy, received suggestions for his comfort with the quick smile that brightened his whole face, and now and then, as I stood tidying the table by his bed, I felt him softly touch my gown, as if to assure himself that I was there. Anything more natural and frank I never saw, and found this brave John as bashful as brave, yet full of excellencies and fine aspirations, which, having no power to express themselves in words, seemed to have bloomed into his character, and made him what he was. After that night, an hour of each evening that remained to him was devoted to his ease or pleasure. He could not talk much, for breath was precious, and he spoke in whispers, but from occasional conversations I gleaned scraps of private history, which only added to the affection and respect I felt for him. Once he asked me to write a letter, and as I settled pen and paper, I said, with an irrepressible glimmer of feminine curiosity, "Shall it be addressed to wife or mother, John?" "Neither, ma'am. I've got no wife, and will write to mother myself when I get better." "Do you think I was married because of this?" he asked, touching a plain ring he wore, and often turned thoughtfully on his finger when he lay alone. "Partly that, but more from a settled sort of look you have, a look which young men seldom get until they marry." "I didn't know that, but I'm not so very young, ma'am, 30 in May, and have been what you might call settled this 10 years, for mother's a widow. I'm the oldest child she has, and it wouldn't do for me to marry until Lizzie has a home of her own, and Laurie's learned his trade, for we're not rich, and I must be father to the children, and husband to the dear old woman if I can." "No doubt but you are both, John. Yet how came you to go to war if you felt so? Wasn't enlisting as bad as marrying?" "No, ma'am, not as I see it. For one is helping my neighbor, the other pleasing myself. I went because I couldn't help it. I didn't want the glory or the pay. I wanted the right thing done, and people kept saying the men who were in earnest ought to fight. I was in earnest, the Lord knows, but I held off as long as I could, not knowing which was my duty. Mother saw the case, gave me her ring to keep me steady, and said, 'Go.' So I went." A short story and a simple one, but the man and the mother were portrayed better than pages of fine writing could have done it. Do you ever regret that you came when you lie here suffering so much? "Never, ma'am. I haven't helped a great deal, but I've shown I was willing to give my life, and perhaps I've got to, but I don't blame anybody, and if it was to do over again, I'd do it. I'm a little sorry I wasn't wounded in front. It looks cowardly to be hit in the back. But I obeyed orders, and it don't matter in the end, I know." Poor John! It did not matter now, except that a shot in the front might have spared the long agony in store for him. He seemed to read the thought that troubled me, as he spoke so hopefully when there was no hope, for he suddenly added, "This is my first battle. Do they think it's going to be my last?" "I'm afraid they do, John." It was the hardest question I had ever been called upon to answer, doubly hard with those clear eyes fixed on mine, forcing a truthful answer by their own truth. He seemed a little startled at first, pondered over the fateful fact a moment, then shook his head with a glance at the broad chest and muscular limbs stretched out before him. "I'm not afraid, but it's difficult to believe all at once. I'm so strong it don't seem possible for such a little wound to kill me." Mary Mercutio's dying words glanced through my memory as he spoke. "'Tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough." And John would have said the same could he have seen the ominous black holes between his shoulders. He never had, and, seeing the ghastly sights about him, could not believe his own wound more fatal than these, for all the suffering it caused him. "Shall I write to your mother now?" I asked, thinking that these sudden tidings might change all plans and purposes, but they did not, for the man received the order of the divine commander to march with the same unquestioning obedience with which the soldier had received that of the human one, doubtless remembering that the first led him to life and the last to death. "No, ma'am, to Laurie, just the same. He'll break it to her best, and I'll add a line to her myself when you get done." So I wrote the letter, which he dictated, finding it better than any I had sent, for though here and there a little ungrammatical or inelegant, each sentence came to me briefly worded, but most expressive, full of excellent counsel to the boy, tenderly bequeathing Mother and Lizzie to his care, and bidding him good-bye in words the sadder for their simplicity. He added a few lines with steady hand, and, as I sealed it, said, with a patient sort of sigh, "I hope the answer will come in time for me to see it." Then, turning away his face, laid the flowers against his lips, as if to hide some quiver of emotion at the thought of such a sudden sundering of all the dear home ties. These things had happened 2 days before. Now John was dying, and the letter had not come. I had been summoned to many deathbeds in my life, but to none that made my heart ache as it did then, since my mother called me to watch the departure of a spirit akin to this in its gentleness and patient strength. As I went in, John stretched out both hands. "I know you'd come. I guess I'm moving on, ma'am." He was, and so rapidly that, even while he spoke, over his face I saw the gray veil falling that no human hand can lift. I sat down by him, wiped the drops from his forehead, stirred the air about him with the slow wave of a fan, and waited to help him die. He stood in sore need of help, and I could do so little, for, as the doctor had foretold, the strong body rebelled against death, and fought every inch of the way, forcing him to draw each breath with a spasm, and clench his hands with an imploring look, as if he asked, "How long must I endure this, and be still?" For hours he suffered dumbly, without a moment's respire, or a moment's murmuring. His limbs grew cold, his face damp, his lips white, and again he tore the covering off his breast, as if the lightest weight added to his agony. Yet through it all his eyes never lost their perfect serenity, and the man's soul seemed to sit therein, undaunted by the ills that vexed his flesh. One by one the men woke, and round the room appeared a circle of pale faces and watchful eyes, full of awe and pity, for, though a stranger, John was beloved by all. Each man there had wondered at his patience, respected his piety, admired his fortitude, and now lamented his hard death, for the influence of an upright nature had made itself deeply felt even in one little week. Presently the Jonathan who so loved his comely David came creeping from his bed for a last look and word. The kind soul was full of trouble, as the choke in his voice, the grasp of his hand betrayed, but there were no tears, and the farewell of the friends was the more touching for its brevity. "Old boy, how are you?" faltered the one. "Most through, thank heaven," whispered the other. "Can I say or do anything for you anywheres?" "Take my things home, and tell them that I did my best." "I will. Good-bye, Ned. Good-bye, John. Good-bye." They kissed each other tenderly, as women, and so parted, for poor Ned could not stay to see his comrade die. For a little while there was no sound in the room but the drip of water from a stump or two, and John's distressful gasps, as he had slowly breathed his life away. I thought him nearly gone, and had just laid down the fan, believing its help to be no longer needed, when suddenly he rose up in his bed, and cried out with a bitter cry that broke the silence, sharply startling everyone with its agonized appeal, "For God's sake, give me air!" It was the only cry pain or death had wrung from him, the only boon he had asked, and none of us could grant it, for all the airs that blew were useless now. Dan flung up the window. The first red streak of dawn was warming the gray east, a herald of the coming sun. John saw it, and, with the love of light which lingers in us to the end, seemed to read in it a sign of hope, of help, for over his whole face there broke that mysterious expression, brighter than any smile, which often comes to eyes that look their last. He laid himself gently down, and, stretching out his strong right arm as if to grasp and bring the blessed air to his lips in a fuller flow, lapsed into a merciful unconsciousness, which assured us that for him suffering was forever past. He died then, for, though the heavy breaths still tore their way up for a little longer, they were but the waves of an ebbing tide that beat unfelt against the wreck which an immortal voyager had deserted with a smile. He never spoke again, but to the end held my hand close, so close that when he was asleep at last I could not draw it away. Dan helped me, warning me as he did so, that it was unsafe for dead and living flesh to lie so long together, but though my hand was strangely cold and stiff, and 4 white marks remained across its back even when warmth and color had returned elsewhere, I could not but be glad that, through its touch, the presence of human sympathy, perhaps, had lightened that hard hour. When they had made him ready for the grave, John lay in state for half an hour, a thing which seldom happened in that busy place, but a universal sentiment of reverence and affection seemed to fill the hearts of all who had known or heard of him. And when the rumor of his death went through the house, always astir, many came to see him, and I felt a tender sort of pride in my lost patient, for he looked a most heroic figure, lying there stately and still as the statue of some young knight asleep upon his tomb. The lovely expression which so often beautifies dead faces soon replaced the marks of pain, and I longed for those who loved him best to see him when half an hour's acquaintance with death had made them friends. As we stood looking at him, the ward-master handed me a letter saying it had been forgotten the night before. It was John's letter, come just an hour too late to gladden the eyes that had longed and looked for it so eagerly. Yet he had it, for after I had cut some brown locks for his mother, and taken off the ring to send her, telling how well the talisman had done its work, I kissed this good son for her sake, and laid the letter in his hand, still folded as when I drew my own away, feeling that its place was there, and making myself happy with the thought that, even in his solitary place in the government lot, he would not be without some token of the love which makes life beautiful and outlives death. Then I left him, glad to have known so genuine a man, and carrying with me an enduring memory of the brave Virginia blacksmith as he lay serenely waiting for the dawn of that long day which knows no night. End of chapter 4. A Night.